Hello everyone, welcome to MedTech Digital Week, brought to you by the producers of the Face-to-Face MedTech Summit, visiting Amsterdam in June 2018. My name is Eric Warner. I'll be your host for today's session, titled EU MDR Labeling Compliance, Learn the Lessons from UDI. First, I'll cover some quick housekeeping items. If you experience difficulties with audio or advancing slides, refresh your screen with F5. If you are experiencing other technical issues, hit the question mark button to receive assistance. At any time during the presentation, submit your questions into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of the slides. All sessions this week are recorded. You'll be emailed in 24 hours and they are available for viewing. Let's now begin by introducing today's speakers. Mark Cusworth, VP of Research and Development at Prism ID, and Andrew Love, VP Capability Development at Be Forward. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Prism ID for sponsoring the event.
Hello and welcome to Prism ID's webinar. In today's webinar, you'll hear more about what the EU MDR compliance means and how it will affect your labelling processes, and what the labelling compliance challenges are and how to overcome them. Presenting today, I'm pleased to have Andrew Love from Be Forward joining me, and myself, I'm Mark Cusworth from Prism ID. We'll be looking at, during this webinar, some of the lessons that we can learn from UDI, and also commenting on why you should look into a labelling system that can adapt to the current regulations, and also some of the regulations we can see coming along from countries that aren't part of the US or the EU. Throughout our presentation, we'll also be referring to the results of a recent survey we undertook, which will give you an insight on how the market perceives the new EU MDR regulations. So, as part of this survey, you can see that 50% of people who responded said that they were not aware, or that they are somewhat aware of the changes required for the EU MDR. We hope that this webinar will clarify for them what is to be done to be compliant ready in time and on budget. That being said, I'd like to hand over now to Andrew Love.
Thank you, Mark. So in this next section of the presentation, I'm going to give an overview of the new European medical device regulations and how they'll affect product supply and product packaging. First, however, some background around the legislation. So these new regulations are a significant change to the legislative framework for medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices supplied to the European Union. Many commentators are describing these as the most significant changes to this legislation in decades. And it's really driven from two main issues. The first one was some serious compliance issues that have happened in the recent past that shows that there are weaknesses with the existing legislation that need to be addressed. But secondly, there are lots of areas of new technology that have been coming through that aren't really covered by the existing legislation. So, for example, nanotechnology, and hence the legislation needs to be updated to be able to deal with these new technologies. This legislation is going to impact anybody who's involved in the design, manufacturing, testing, approval of medical devices in the EU. So, significant number of people impacted across a large scope of activity for medical devices. Coming back to the PRISM survey that was done recently, we asked how much of an impact did companies think the EU MDR regulations would have. And you can see from this slide that more than 2/3 saw that there would be a medium to high impact. So it's a significant issue across the industry, and many companies are seeing that this is a significant issue. So looking at the upper part of this slide, it shows a typical life cycle for a medical device product. So obviously at the beginning of the product life cycle, you're developing and registering your device, you manufacture it. There's an activity called system and procedure packaging. This is where a third party might take a number of different elements of products and put them together into a procedure pack for a specific operation or procedure to be undertaken by a healthcare professional. Repacking activities, where someone may take someone else's product and repack it for sale in another territory. Reprocessing, where someone would take a device that's been used and reprocess that so it can be reused again and again and again. You've then obviously got your post-market surveillance and vigilance activities, monitoring the effectiveness of the product in the marketplace. And then you get into recalls and discontinuation. So that's a fairly typical life cycle of a product. And the new regulations are going to impact every single stage of that product life cycle with newer revised requirements that companies will have to meet. On the lower half of the slide, you can see a series of capabilities. These are things that companies need to have in place to be able to undertake the activities on the upper half of the slide. And again, these capabilities are going to need to be enhanced or developed, or in some cases, new capabilities introduced that companies don't already have. So many things will change within companies for them to be able to comply with the new regulations. Looking at this slide, it shows the various groups that are involved in the supply of medical devices to the EU. So if you look again at the upper half of the slide, the light blue box, these are what are called economic operators within the legislation. So top left, you've got device manufacturers, which are fairly obvious. You have your system and procedure packagers, which we've discussed on the previous slide, your repackers, your reprocessors, and also parts suppliers. And all of these, including in some cases the parts suppliers, in the new legislation are considered as device manufacturers in their own right. In the middle of the slide, you've then got a statement which is the person responsible for regulatory compliance. So anyone who's supplying medical devices will need to have a person who is responsible for the regulatory compliance of those products. Now, that doesn't need to be a full-time employee, but it needs to be a service that's provided and is similar in some ways to a qualified person within the pharmaceutical industry. Below that, we see a statement for authorized representatives. So any device manufacturer that doesn't have a physical presence within the EU will have to have an authorized representative who markets their products on their behalf, who is physically located in the EU. And those authorized representatives will carry a number of the responsibilities of the device manufacturer and will need to have a person responsible for regulatory compliance. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see the importers, the distributors, and the health institutions. Now, within the regulation, the requirements for all of these economic operators are stated clearly around what these economic operators have to do to meet the requirements of the legislation. Across the bottom half of this slide, you've then got the governance groups that are involved. So on the top left, you've got the Committee on Medical Devices, who were the group who developed the new legislation. And this will evolve into a new group called the Medical Device Coordination Group, which will be comprised of representatives from the various national authorities across the member states of the EU. And this group will provide oversight to the regulation and provide approvals in certain cases for certain activities. You've then got the national authorities and competent bodies that sit in the individual countries who have the responsibility for the execution of the regulations within their country. Moving along, you can then see that you have the notified bodies. These are the third parties that companies work with to have their products reviewed, tested, and registered so they can get their CE marking to be able to market in Europe. All notified bodies will have to reapply for their license to be notified bodies. and it's expected that there will be fewer notified bodies in future, and the notified bodies that exist will have a narrower scope than they potentially currently do. So companies are going to have to think about which notified bodies they deal with and how that may change. Reference laboratories are there to help the national authorities and the notified bodies around setting standards. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see the statement UDI, which is the new pan-European database that's being set up to hold all relevant medical device information around the registration and testing and post-market surveillance and vigilance around medical devices sold in Europe. And this will be accessible by the national authorities and competent bodies, the notified bodies, and certain areas will be available to device manufacturers, healthcare professionals, and even the public. So a large number of different actors are impacted by the legislation, and you can see that there are different impacts that each of them have, and each of these groups are going to have to think about what they need to do to evolve to meet the requirements of these new regulations. In this next slide, we look at some of the timelines. Now, the timelines are vague, but this will evolve over time to give us more information about what will be required and when, but some key milestones to highlight on this slide. So first of all, the regulation is published. It was published in the middle of this year, so it's now in force. By the end of next year, so by the end of 2018, the expectation is that the UDI database will be available and the new notified bodies will be defined and in place. And then from May 2020 for medical device products, and from May 2022 for IVD products, that's when the regulation will be effective. Now, the impact around how products will be phased in and re-registered is not clear yet. There will need to be timelines defined for how that will happen, and there is much discussion still going on across the European influencing bodies around how that will happen. So timelines at the moment are not particularly clear, but that will likely become clearer as we move forward. So we've talked about some of the impact that the legislation will have, but there's a few other ones on this slide that I want to highlight. So if we look at the left-hand side, first of all, the scope and classification of products. So class 1, class 2, class 3 will continue as was, but the requirements are changing somewhat. So some products will move into a higher classification than they've been in before. And there are many products which are currently not classified as medical devices that will be classified in the future. So for example, cosmetic contact lenses will now be considered a medical device and will be subject to the regulation. We've then got common specifications, technical files, clinical evidence, vigilance, etc. There are a lot more requirements for the pre-marketing testing and post-marketing assessment of products. So companies are going to find that when they come to re-register their products for the new legislation, they're going to have to likely provide far more information than they provided in the past. This is going to make the registration processes more onerous, and time will need to be built into re-registration processes to be able to do that. Moving down a number of, because we talked about a few of these, I'd like to focus on unannounced audits towards the bottom of the list. So the notified will be permitted now, or will be expected now, to perform unannounced audits on the manufacturers that they've provided registrations for. This is a new requirement that the notified bodies haven't particularly done as yet. Some have started doing these audits already, and companies will need to be prepared for notified bodies coming in and doing these unannounced audits. The other things on the left-hand side here we've touched on, so in the interest of time, I'm not going to focus on them. But if we move to the right-hand side, you can see that there are also a number of impacts that we will see around labeling processes. I'd like to talk about those a bit more on the next slides. So let's just have a look at a bit more detail about what the labeling compliance challenges are and some of the things that companies will need to do to overcome them. So product re-registration, I've talked already about how there are more requirements around registration that will generate more information, more testing, more documentation. It's considered unlikely that companies will just be able to grandfather their existing products through a registration process to be registered under the new legislation. They will have to go through a full registration process, and this potentially will change content that will have to go on the labeling or the artwork for products as it's being re-registered. This isn't clear yet. Companies will have to assess this, but there is a risk that these new registration requirements will require further information on the packaging. Secondly, the regulation highlights a number of things that companies will have to put on the artwork, which they may not have stated already. So companies are going to need to go through these new requirements in the regulation and audit against their existing labeling to identify if there are gaps that they're going to have to address, and then provide that further content appropriately. The legislation brings in the requirements for UDI marking, and Mark is going to discuss that further in the next session. But what companies will have to do from a packaging perspective is obviously determine where on the packaging they're going to place the UDIs. They may need to create space on the artwork for the UDIs to be added. And in some cases, where it's a reprocessed medical device, the UDI will have to be applied to the device as well as the packaging. Because obviously when a device gets used, it gets separated from the packaging, and when it's reprocessed, you need to keep the chain of history of that device. Final point on this slide is then portfolio rationalization and elimination of unnecessary products. So again, a number of experts in the field are considering that companies, when they start looking at their portfolios and what they need to do and change to meet these regulations, will take the opportunity to review portfolios and prune where necessary to take out products that maybe they don't want to market anymore. So again, there's a packaging and labeling challenge in there to make sure that the packaging and labeling activities have been appropriately considered. So these create a number of issues. They'll create issues around resources, because there will be a large requirement for work here. There may be a requirement for more systems, and again, Mark will talk about that in the next section. And there's going to be a lot of change required, and we can expect that the regulatory approvals will become a bottleneck as we go through this process, because there are so many products that will need to be updated to meet the legislation. So notwithstanding all of the rest of the regulation that I talked about before, just this packaging update is a significant program in its own right for many companies, but will need to be factored in to the overall program within a company to meet the requirements of the regulations. So I'd like to thank you for listening to this part of the presentation, and I'll now hand over to Mark, who will talk further about UDI. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So when the FDA published its final rule on UDI, or unique device identification, it caused quite a stir. It was probably the most significant change to product identification and labeling systems since the introduction of the regulations on electronic signatures. Now, with the introduction of the EU MDR regulations, we see another wave of significant changes that's going to impact these companies that have either just completed their UDI changes as well as including companies that previously may have got away with not being impacted by UDI and are facing the challenges for the first time. It's therefore good to take a step back at this point so that we can evaluate some of the lessons that have been learnt along the road to UDI compliance. We can have a look at some of the pains that people experienced and how they can be avoided this time. Now, we've heard many concerns, and you can see some of them on this slide here. And today we're going to be concentrating on labelling and packaging and reference the lessons that we've learned from the FDA's UDI Go Live. So the first lesson that we're going to look at, and this really can't be emphasised enough, is that the time to act is now. You cannot wait any longer. In our experience, we've seen small and large companies implement UDI, and do not underestimate what an undertaking this is. From the outset, identifying the impact that UDI was actually going to have on a business was not understood. And as projects developed, more people and departments ended up becoming involved than was initially expected. We saw timelines of many projects change due to the complexities and the politics that became involved. Now, once the impact and the strategy was identified, it then ended up taking a lot longer to get approval than was originally expected, because so many departments, budgets required approval and more senior agreement. An additional problem, which was experienced by some of the late adopters, was that they struggled to get suppliers on board with their timelines, since they were already significantly committed on other customers' projects. So really, do not underestimate the amount of time and resources necessary to do the work to get your new systems in to meet these requirements. Now, the EU MDR has more complexity than what UDI had. UDI had a big impact, but the EU MDR is going to be even more significant. It's not only the requirements that are more extensive, but you're also having to deal with the EU plus the individual member states that are involved in it. So you really need to ensure that you start as early as possible and plan your resources, both internal and external. Now, looking at the results of the survey, we see that 50% of responses have already made a good start. Now, this is better than what we experienced with UDI, which is good. They understand the impact and are planning or have already got plans and budgets in place. Now, if you're not in that 50%, then now really is the time to get started. There will be parts of the timeline that you are in control of, but there are other parts where you'll be dependent on other bodies. The UDIMED submissions will be processed on a first-come, first-served basis. So where you are in control, you need to do the best you can to get yourself ahead of the game. Now, according to the survey, there is a high level of confidence that solutions will be in place to meet the deadlines. From what we saw for UDI, some of this optimism was due to not fully understanding just how significant the impact of these changes is going to be. Since we saw in the previous result that 50% of responses are still in the early stages, I'd warn you not to be overly optimistic. The bottom line is, if your license is delayed, you're not going to be able to supply your devices. And the later you start, the higher this risk will become. Now, the second issue that we saw was where companies categorized UDI as purely a labeling problem. We saw some companies where the intention was to implement and roll out a new label design system, and that would solve all the problems that they were going to have with UDI. Some other companies saw this as an issue that was going to impact label design, but also regulatory. And they ran individual projects in those two different areas to actually meet those requirements. But each project was run in complete isolation to each other. Now, where we saw companies where they viewed this as a cross-departmental problem, there's much more better opportunities for these companies to involve different skill sets. So the number of people involved in that project gave the company a much better oversight and ability to actually provide a solution that met the requirements needed for the UDI. As well as having understanding of each department that was involved, having a good overview of the business is also critical to ensure that the solution not only fits where you are now, but where the company is going in the future. Understanding the vision for your company is very important, and very often it's difficult for people who are involved in the day-to-day operations to really have a good understanding of how that future picture and that future plan fits in with the systems you're going to be implementing. So as you embark on the EU MDR solutions, you should consider what departments need to be involved in the solution. Now, when we look at the people who responded to our survey, you can see there is some correlation between those who responded and the areas where people see impact being. And typically, people who were in specific roles could see how the EU MDR regulations were going to be impacting them. So having the correct people working on the implementation becomes critical to help you understand not just how you currently work, but also to see the potential that the changes can give you, and also to keep the business point of view as part of the longer view of this implementation in these projects. Now, do not expect that you'll have all the skills you need already. In our survey, we saw that over a third of replies recognised that additional skills would be required to be able to implement their solutions. Only in understanding the regulations and their implications do we achieve just over half of the people believing that they have the resources available internally. Adding somebody who has already experienced a similar solution, maybe UDI at another company, can be very beneficial to the whole team. And also, don't forget your suppliers as part of this. Having a good relationship with your suppliers of your different systems can enable you to lean on some of their skills and experiences. The third important thing is to accept that some of your existing systems may no longer be capable of meeting your new requirements. One of the changes for UDI that caused a problem for a number of our customers was having to include a different GTIN on each level of packaging, and this is similar with the EU MDR regulations. The problem was that their device data was designed to have a single identifier, and there was no place to store different GTINs. Now, some systems where it was not possible to make changes to store this extra data ended up splitting this information across different systems. So, for instance, you may have the product data stored in one system, but then the GTINs would be stored as part of the labeling system. Now, we've seen that where the single source of truth is, where you've got that data, but unfortunately, it might not be in a way that, or a system that's easy to get hold of, either because the system doesn't have interfaces that provide the data in a useful manner, or even that the format of that data is in a way that makes it difficult to be used. So as part of this and looking at EU MDR, I'd encourage you again to look at your data and see where's the best place for that data to be stored and that data to be maintained. Now, also, I'd encourage you to involve your suppliers again. None of our customers use every piece of the functionality in our system, and we wouldn't expect them to. And your other systems are going to be very similar. Your current systems may very well be capable and have the functionality required to solve some of the problems that you're going to be facing, if only you were aware of them. Speak to your suppliers, and they may be able to guide you into using the tools that you may already have. And finally, on this, the fit for purpose test applies not only to your software, but also to your hardware. Having to ensure barcode quality met UDI requirements introduced new challenges for some of our customers, whether it's during the design and approval process or actually during final production. Ensuring the equipment is maintained to a standard that is guaranteed to achieve the quality required and designed during the design and approval processes is critical to actually ensuring a system continues to meet the requirements that it's designed to meet. Now, looking at just the subject of serialization, we can see from the survey that we took that already a fifth of the responses recognise that they will need to implement serialization, with nearly 2/3 not yet sure. Now, this is just one example of where new skills, procedures, systems and hardware may be required for you to implement an EU MDR compliant system. Ensuring that any limitations of systems are clearly understood is critical to putting in a system that is not going to cause you problems in a longer term. Be careful not to use systems in a way that they were not designed to be used. A single ineffective system can have a significant influence on the effectiveness of the whole solution, and you don't want to compromise your entire system due to one legacy component. Now, coming on to the fourth lesson, we need to look at your data. How reliable is that data? Some of the comments we've heard when discussing this with customers include things like, it is often wrong, so we don't use it. Or waiting for corrections that we do not control means that we cannot meet our performance targets. And there are others which result in people not storing data where it should be stored or maintaining it where it should be stored, or ending up with multiple versions of data which are then inconsistent and can cause much more significant problems. Ensuring that you understand your data model, where it is stored and how it is maintained is critical when it comes to modifying the existing systems to support the additional requirements that UDI demanded or that's required for the EU MDR. Putting the data in the system that is easiest to configure will end up compromising the integrity of that data. If people do not have confidence in the data, they're unlikely to use it. And we've seen that many times. Rebuilding that confidence can then be very difficult. If you store the data in the wrong system or have it maintained by the wrong people, this will significantly affect how sustainable your system will be. Ensuring that the solution not only allows you to get the data in and get the solution in to meet the current requirements, but also that it is in the best place where that will be maintained as you go into the future, and that it meets the requirements of all the consumers of that data is critical. The key thing here really is that data must be owned and maintained by the correct people. Do not work around problems, rather resolve them and assure the integrity of your data is maintained. Now, the last lesson is about looking at what the future holds. Adopting UDI was more than just complying with the latest set of regulations, and even more so with the EU MDR. Some of our customers have used it as an opportunity to review their entire product branding, to standardize on sizes of packaging, layout and style of labels, production of IFUs, or management of translatable content. The opportunity was taken to implement new systems that allow them to adapt to future changes without it having the same impact as implementing UDI had on them. A problem that faced some of our customers was that the timescale required to make the changes necessary were not achievable in the timeframes required by the FDA. Now, rather than compromising the solution, what some customers did was they implemented smaller workarounds which were put in place, which allowed them to meet the immediate timeframes for the FDA, but they then continue to implement the more extensive solution to give them the ability and the flexibility that were required to enable the system to perform in the long term. So don't let the immediate deadlines of the EU MDR prevent you putting in the correct solutions, even if that means having to put some temporary ones in the meantime. We started off by discussing some of the significance of changes and how many parts of the business UDI affected. To help deal with spike in workload, when the system first came online, some companies put together a special working team that had all the end-to-end roles for data entry, label design, approval, and submissions. This team was then able to fast-track getting the new systems into operation. So to summarize, the first thing really is the clock is ticking. Do not wait. Ensure the correct people and skill sets are used. I mentioned how some customers created dedicated teams to fast-track the workload. This model works well, but only as a one-off. It's not sustainable as a regular occurrence. If you dedicate such a significant amount of resources, ensure that the system that they're implementing and that they're putting the data into actually will meet the next global change that occurs, and that you do not have to start all over again. Take the opportunity to step back and evaluate what you have already. Ensuring that you implement a solution that is designed to help you deal with changes which have a broad impact is key to this. And submissions and label content depend on the consistency and accuracy of your data. Your solution is only as good as the data that you have, so ensure that it is easy to maintain and easy to ensure that that data is correct and accurate. And the last point here really is that do not expect this to be the last set of regulatory changes. Our culture at the moment is very reactionary, and we can expect to see further changes in the future. Even in the near future, we could see UDI implementation from around the world being finalised. And remember that a well-implemented solution to UDI or EU MDR, when done properly, can give you a competitive edge. It gives you the ability to react to change and even reduce your time to market. So how should your labelling system look in this new world? A modern label solution is as much about data that is used on the labels as it is about the label designs themselves. The data needs to be structured in a way that makes sense to your company. And the things I would emphasize here is your ability to enter data, your ability to then maintain that data, approve it, and then how that data is consumed. Making sure that you cover those four components is critical to getting a system that can meet your current requirements, but can also support your business in the future. One of the things which is often overlooked is how easy it is to make changes to the data, particularly when those changes impact a large number or even all of your products. Just being able to identify what the impact of a change is in some systems can be very complex. Having a system where you can easily identify what a change and what's impacted by it is critical. And remember that even though a modern labelling system is data-driven, don't lose sight of the fact that what you're doing is creating something that is visual. Being able to view what an IFU or a label looks like while maintaining your data can be very useful in getting things right the first time. Now, label design has become so much more than just being able to print sticky labels. You should be able to design and manage all of the artwork for your product in one system. A label design system that's fit for purpose will support single or multi-page designs through a variety of production mechanisms, whether it's inkjet or thermal transfer label printers, third-party booklet manufacturers, or even electronic format for display or download from the web. Do not undo all the hard work that you've gained from implementing a well-designed data-driven system if the label design cannot actually adapt to the many variations that will be required. For a traditional single panel label, every piece of white space is valuable. The EU MDR requires more information to be added to what was already a very busy space. It's no longer enough to just dynamically size content to fit in regular spaces on the label. Being able to flow data around images or barcodes can allow areas of label to be used that were previously unavailable. Every piece of white space is valuable. If you're not only going to produce artwork that meets regulatory requirements, but it also needs to meet the aesthetic requirements that you want to project as a company for how you want your products to be seen. Now, for your data to be compliant, you must have a version controlled and an approval system to manage that data. Now, you should be able to include all the information and display the content in such a way that it makes it easy and efficient for people to approve that content. Typically, the people that you've got approving your labels or your data are very busy people, and they're typically involved in many different things. Being able to present that information in a way that makes it as easy as possible for them to see that the content is correct and it meets the requirements is important so that they can get the content approved as easily as possible and as quickly as possible. And what's also important, and implementing UDI or the EU MDR highlights, is that an approval mechanism should assist you in routing a large amount of related information within a single request, so that the approval of similar products or similar changes, again, can be simplified to make that approval mechanism as efficient as possible. This cannot be overstated, particularly when you have a large product portfolio and you're facing things like the EU MDR timelines. Now, as important as all these things are, you've got to be able to produce the right thing at the right time with the right content. What is it that triggers the printing? You may have multi-stage print processes where the production data is staged and approved before printing. You may have a line control system that automatically triggers printing of labels and IFUs. It's also likely that the print operation will require different data from different sources, whether it's batch information coming from your ERP, serialization information being provided, or your product data coming from your single source of truth, whether it's in the labeling system or in a product master database. The system you use to produce your labeling must be able to link to and combine these various sources of data to generate the complete set of data at the point of printing. In a similar way, label production takes on many forms. You may be printing single panel labels on a thermal transfer printer, probably still the most popular way to combine quality and performance and cost. But in the future, this is just a starting point. It can be necessary to export the artwork for your instructions for use, to have third-party manufacturers take advantage of technologies that you do not have in-house. You may choose to bring the IFU printing in-house so that they can be printed at the point of manufacturing, so you're not having to manage large and varied quantities of stock. This also reduces the risk of including the wrong IFU with a product. So we've covered and looked at a number of different challenges and looked at how the labeling system of the future can help you meet these requirements. Now, across the life sciences industry, the way in which organisations approach the design, creation and printing of labels has historically been both inconsistent and fragmented. The reality is that in today's increasingly competitive and regulated global marketplace, such approaches leave organisations increasingly vulnerable to mislabeling, inconsistencies, voluntary recalls, or at worst, non-compliance and non-adherence to regulations. In addition, any need to implement a global change to label content actually suddenly becomes a complex, costly, and a very high-risk project. Now, a label design system that's fit for purpose will support single multi-page designs through a variety of production mechanisms. It will provide the ability to use inkjet thermal printers linked to third-party manufacturers. And our Prism 360 solution was created in collaboration with working groups from many of the industry's leading medical device and pharmaceutical companies. Prism 360 is designed to address the specific challenges that organizations in this industry face, and that you can see on this screen. Changing regulations such as EU MDR need to be incorporated into the label and artwork processes appropriately and in time for when the regulations take effect. And Prism 360 may be the right solution for you. So give us a call to discuss this more. With this being said, thank you for listening. And again, thank you very much to Andrew. And we'll now be going into
Thank you, Mark and Andrew, for an excellent presentation. We've received a few questions already, but we'll give the rest of you a moment to enter your questions in the Q&A box to the left of the slides. I just have one quick announcement before we start the Q&A. I'd like to quickly draw your attention to our face-to-face MedTech Summit, which takes place June 11th to 15th in Amsterdam next year. At this market-leading annual event, you can learn from hundreds of experts and peers. Now let's begin the Q&A. First question. How is the regulation approaching combined products, medicinal products containing a medical device? Andrew, could you take this one?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to answer your questions. I think this is an excellent question, but not one with a particularly easy answer, unfortunately. If you look at the US, we have a very clear definition of what a combination product is, and there are clear rules for how you work with those. But unfortunately, in Europe, as it stands at the moment, the definition of a combination product and the rules that you apply are much less clear. There's nothing within the EU MDR regulation that makes that situation clearer. And whilst there is conversation going on around what does the EU need to do to be clearer around combination products, that's unlikely to be resolved within the time frame that companies are going to work to. Current thinking is that companies need to approach the EU MDR regulation in the same way as they have been with existing combination products. So if you have that product registered primarily as a pharmaceutical product, then take that route forward. But I think the thing that you really need to do is work with the notified bodies that you're dealing with, or the partners that you're getting those medical devices from, or your own internal expertise, and test that back with the appropriate health authorities to make sure that you are following the right route. So, in summary, the situation is not clear. It's unlikely to get clearer, and you need to make sure that you're taking professional advice when you're doing your product registrations moving forward. So,
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for that question.
Next one's for Mark. Can you give us a summary of the EU MDR label changes?
Yes, I'll be happy to do that. So, as far as the actual labelling requirements are concerned, the EU MDR really is clamping down and putting some tighter regulation on that, and even more so than the US FDA regulations did. Now, a lot of these changes really are identified in Chapter 3 of the regulations, and so Chapter is the requirements regarding the information supplied with the device. And in Section 23.2, that focuses specifically on the labels themselves. Now, to really give a summary of some of those items in there where we can see changes, some of those include reprocessing of single-use devices, where now there's a requirement to not only just identify whether this is single-use or not, but also if it's been reprocessed, then there's requirements in there to indicate that something has been reprocessed, which may be to do with re-sterilization, disinfection or cleaning, but also to indicate on there how many reprocessing cycles have been performed on this device already, and also if there's actually a maximum number of times this device can be reprocessed. Now, this can have a significant impact on the information that you're having to store against that individual device, so that when you come to reprocess it, you have that information regarding reprocessing available. Other things which are, again, impacting on the critical white space you have available on your labels is we have the medical device indication, which is expected to be similar to the IVD icon that's currently being used, but will also be rolled out to include medical devices as well. For investigational only items, there will be a new text that has to go onto those labels, which identifies that this is exclusively for clinical investigation. And this has translation implications as well. There's some additional information for residual risks. So for pregnant women or other such vulnerable groups, there's additional information that's going to be required on those labels. There's also some changes that are coming with regards to the symbols that go on those labels. So the harmonisation of those symbols is something that's been going through the EU for a few years now, and a number of attempts have been made to finalise those. We have the new regulations for those, but they're not yet harmonised, and that's expected to be concluded for the EU MDR labelling requirements. Another area which is there's significant new changes is in terms of electronic labelling, which there's a number of requirements which say you have to do things. So in the new regulations, there's a requirement that any information that's included on your labels will also have to be made available on your website for those products. As well as that, though, there's opportunities to improve your products and how your products are identified, and how users, whether it's end users or clinicians, can get information. And there's the new EIFU symbol that will be included as part of that. And so as a quick summary, really the main areas are, you've got the single-use devices, medical device indicator, in clinical investigation only devices, residual risks for vulnerable patients, additional warnings and symbols, electronic labelling, and then we've got the UDI changes, which we'll probably cover that a bit more on some of the other questions that are coming up. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We have another question for you. What are the differences between the FDA UDI requirements and the MDR UDI requirements?
As far as the UDI is concerned, there's a lot of consistency between the FDA and the EU MDR in terms of the labelling and how your UDI is constructed. So as far as the UDI is concerned, it consists of two main parts. The DI, which is what uniquely identifies a device. And this is typically constructed of two parts: a basic DI, which is used to identify the device at the unit of use, and is what's used to register the device against the GUDID or the UDIMED databases. And then there's secondary DIs if your device is going to be packaged in different quantities, so you may have several items packaged together. Now, the DI forms only part of the UDI. The second part, which is PI, which is what's used to identify a particular instance or product of a product family. And this will consist of typically either serial number and or the lot number, whether you're identifying individual components or part of a lot run. It will include the manufacturer and or the expiry date, and for items which contain software will also contain the software identification, so it could be a version of the software. Now, it's typical to include this data in the barcode, and this may be one or more barcodes on the label. Now, it's important to recognise that the DI component of that is actually key. What is currently really, we're seeing the GS1, HIBCC and the ICBAR as the authorities which are licensing this. And there may be some others coming with the EU MDR, but they're the ones that are primarily listed. And currently we're really seeing GS1 as the dominant issuing agency within our customer base. And the GS1 really defines what that DI will look like and how that's managed. Now, within the data that actually goes on your labels, the barcodes themselves must contain the DI and PI components, and they may be contained within a single barcode or multiple barcodes. And as well, the EU MDR and the UDI and the FDA UDI allow you to also include additional data as part of that barcode, which you need to be careful of because it does push you to include the UDI components at the start of that data, and then any additional piece of data you want to include at the end, which somewhat goes against some of the GS1 guidelines that you should include all your fixed length AIs first within that barcode, but the UDI is pushing you to include your UDI data, so things like your lot number would need to come earlier in that data. But principally, what the requirements for what makes up the UDI in terms of the DI and the PI for your FDA and your EU MDR are very consistent, and you should be able to use the same solution to meet those requirements. If anything, the EU MDR is putting additional restrictions and requirements on top of what the FDA introduced initially. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Does the new EU MDR provide anything specific about confidentiality obligations? This one's for Andrew.
Yeah, another great question. So I think if you go back to early on in our presentation, we talked about the various actors that are involved in the supply of medical devices. And if you think of all those different actors, there's all sorts of different confidentiality obligations between them and the broader public at large as well. The legislation does contain some obligations, but broadly speaking, they're quite broad brush statements at this stage. And as the legislation gets drawn down into delegated acts, etc., you could expect to see those become more specific. I think the primary area of concern will be the new UDI database and information that's published into that database and who can have access to that. And whilst the EU is saying that there will be controls around who can access what data, they've not specifically said who can see what data as yet. So I think that's still a moving position, but there certainly is an understanding that much of the data that can be held here has got confidential implications for certain parties, and that must be addressed. But I would refer you to the legislation for the specific statements that are held within that.
Thank you, Andrew. That's all the time we have for questions today. If your question wasn't answered, keep in mind that the speakers will reach out to you directly. Before we wrap up, Mark is going to mention a couple words about our resources that it's available from a link within the downloadable slides. You can access the slides by clicking the resource list below the Q&A box.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone who has joined us today. And also I'd like to thank Andrew Love from BeForward, who has joined me in doing today's webinar. Now, together with BeForward, we've developed a white paper that discusses the EU MDR labelling compliance and a useful guide to the EU MDR label compliance. Both of these can be found on our website, and they're also linked from the downloadable resource with this webinar. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us. That concludes our webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andrew. And also thank you to Prism ID for sponsoring MedTech Digital Week. To all of you in the audience, we appreciate your time today. Before you log off, please take a moment to answer the feedback form that will pop up on your screen. On behalf of Connect 365 Life Sciences, have a great day.